When I got the call, I drove into the parking lot of the Rockridge BART station in Oakland. My sister said, "If you want to see Dad while he's still lucid, you better fly home to New York now." That was February 2012. 1 month after the launch of our first product, 5 days after moving into a new house, 2 weeks after I told my 5-year-old daughter that we were going to live in two houses because of a thing called divorce, and 2 months before the stomach cancer would kill him. The only certainty I had most mornings was that my 5-year-old wanted dinosaur eggs for breakfast every single time. There was no roadmap for 3 first-time co-founders to navigate through this, nor was there a roadmap for going remote first in 2012, and definitely not for helping fix healthcare.gov, and for that matter, building a 110-person company with 45% women and 35% people of color and LGBTQI folks. We learned a lot about navigating through uncertainty, and I've coalesced what we've learned into a framework called Move to Edge, Declare at Center. But first, a story about transformation. No, not another butterfly story. It's not going to be that. But it is going to be about imaginal cells. Imaginal cells are these amazing cells inside a caterpillar. They're not for the function of the caterpillar, so it will eat through your garden anyway. However, it is important for the transformation of a butterfly because when they connect, they help the caterpillar transform by sending it up into a chrysalis and then instigate it to dissolve into complete goo. But those imaginal cells are special because they have all the blueprints for wings, antenna, and legs. They're the architects, and they assemble a butterfly out of the chaos of goo, and out comes a butterfly. Now those imaginal cells are programmed. They have a playbook, if you might say, to engineer structure in the midst of chaos and goo. Well, frankly, I would have loved a program to deal with 2020 and the overtime called 2021. We had pandemics, we had fires, we had protests stateside and worldwide, we had a riot at the Capitol. And it feels sometimes like everything is dissolving. And yet we still have to make decisions in the midst of that. Do we let good people go? Do we risk exposure to COVID? Do we give flex time for parents who suddenly found themselves elementary school teachers as well as designers and engineers? So, honest question. How many of us froze when we didn't know the answer of those questions? How many of us were frightened because of potential backlash if we didn't say the right thing at the right time? We're not programmed like imaginal cells, we're human. And we don't have playbooks for these types of problems, in part because the problems are different. They're complex. Let me tell you a little bit about it. There's 2 ways to classify problems, complicated and complex. Both have millions of interactive elements. However, complicated problems are more structured, more ordered, the interactions are well understood, and they're more linear. Complex problems, on the other hand, are interdependent, non-linear, and therefore not predictable, especially at scale. Complicated is sort of like trying to build a plane. If you have a plan for a plane and sufficient time and capital, when you build it, you'll build a plane and not an aircraft carrier. However, if you try and solve a complex problem and the reactions change, you might optimize for the wrong thing. When my co-founder Mark Verlot was at the early days of healthcare.gov, one of the mantras was, when everything's on fire, where do you put the fire hose? Because you might put out a fire here and make something worse there. The real problem is when there's a mismatch. And unfortunately, we've inherited complicated problem-solving styles, complicated leadership models, optimization-driven command and control execution, and on urgent, complex problems, that's not the right call. From COVID to climate change, navigating through them sometimes feels like being in the goo. And when we don't know, what's the core of that feeling? What's the core of the feeling when you realize you don't know the answer? Because frankly, we've all been trained since grade school to have all the answers, have them faster, and have them better than everybody else. And as leaders, that hasn't changed. We're supposed to have all the answers, but complex problems don't work like that. So what's the alternative? We've navigated through a lot of uncertainty, and Move to Edge Declare Framework Center is a framework. Framework for when you have to navigate through uncertainty. So instead of holding your breath, you can actually move forward, make decisions, and bring the company around as well. They're coalesced into a series of practices. So here's the basics. Move to the Edge is moving to the edge of your knowledge, your abilities, your data, and your insights, and implementing practices so the organization can learn on that edge. Declare It Center is taking those learnings and then building systems to make those insights scale, be predictable, and reliable with less effort over time. So that's the basics, but let me illustrate with an actual event from Truss's history. Building a diverse remote company is problem number one, and then how to build a remote-first company is problem number two. Here's the setting. It's 2012 we founded the company. The ongoing mantra was, don't worry about diversity, build a world-class team instead, be hyper-focused, as if the two concepts can't be the same. We looked at the data, and we looked at data from professors like Kathy Williams, who were able to show greater returns to stock price and innovation when you have diverse boards, teams, and leaders. We also looked at the data that said women and people of color are being paid less than white men for the same jobs. And that's something across industries and has persisted. So we had a hypothesis if we wanted to go forward. And it was about making all salaries transparent. So talk about stepping into the goo. We're dealing with race, gender, equity, and people's money. How do we move forward? I'm going to show you a series of steps. The first question, and all these start with questions, is everybody going to stay? So we did a survey. Yay. And then, how do we make sure we're solving the right problem? We often use a process called discovery and framing. Discovery is a set of research techniques with different stakeholders, and framing is about framing the right question. Again, so you don't optimize or solve for the wrong problem. Now, trust is really important, and we made sure to communicate even though we didn't know the answers. In some ways, we simplified it to this. Here's what we said we were going to do. Here's what we did. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we'll do next. And here's when we're going to. It's amazing how much that level of clarity can move things along. Now, this section was the majority of the work because we didn't have sufficient rubrics. But we did the research using multiple people in the organization. The reason is, your new people or your junior people often can ask questions that reveal the assumptions you have about a problem. And then unknowns, which gives me a chance to talk about one of my favorite processes, the pre-mortem. So imagine you have your team 1 or 2 weeks before you launch. And you sit them down and you say, okay, everybody, project yourselves 9 months down the road and the project has completely failed. Write down the 3 reasons why. It's amazing what new information comes up when you look at it that way, and you still have time to mitigate them. Now, all these happened over a course of 10 months, working at the edge of our knowledge. In December of 2016, we decided to reveal. And how did it go? People were curious, and there were questions, but no one left, there was no fights. But there was one gotcha. Employee 1 said, hey, employee number 2, I think, needs to be paid more. We realized not only was she correct, but we needed to build a system in order for that to happen. That's the signal to Declare It Center, building an infrastructure. So the questions changed. We did processes like create decision records, which is simply who made the decision, what alternatives were considered, what are the risks, and when did it happen, and what was the decision. We made sure that we stayed accountable by putting the tools of measurement with the team that's engaged in the challenge. In this case, the recruiting and hiring team. But we made the results transparent to the organization to make sure that we keep ourselves accountable. I want to focus on policy here. Policy is not just the what, it's the why, it's the purpose. And it's important when you're doing something around diversity and inclusion to include why we're doing this. We have a comp committee. Their job is to make sure that comp is equitable. And again, that includes multiple people from the organization. Volunteer, 6-month term. And retros are an incredibly embedded part of Truss. Take a second here, although the details are in the show notes as well as all the rest of the processes that I'm mentioning. Simply put, you take your teams after a project is done, spend time talking about what went well, write them down, what didn't go well, write those down, have discussions, and then create action items. But there's 3 things really that's key here. 1, these retros are blameless. The goal is to learn, not to point fingers. That enables new information to come out so you can improve. Second, the teams have context. And third, it generates actionable outcomes. So, move to the edge is being at the edge of your knowledge, and practices to help you learn. Declared center is taking those learnings, scale them so they become repeatable and actionable. Now, this might seem like a lot of work. And at first, it is a little bit. It's sort of like building a new habit. It feels kludgy at first. However, over time, it becomes easier, it becomes automatic. If you do it right, it becomes part of your culture. So, I've talked about an early experience in 2016. I'm going to update with a second example from a remote case that's happening right now. In the show notes, I've included the Truss Distributed Playbook. We've been distributed since 2012, and one of the best business decisions we've ever made. But we continue to face new challenges. This was our company in 2019 at our first in-person offsite. And for a virtual company, that's really important to get people all in a room and discover who we are together. But in 2020, we couldn't go to New Orleans in April and we couldn't go in December, so we realized we want to get people together. How do we do that? So how do you have a virtual offsite for a virtual company? Well, we reached out to our imaginal selves, including folks from Tugboat, and we decided we were going to do 3 4-hour offsite times once a month from October to December. We know how to do this. We survey people, find out what they need and they want, except we didn't do it right. We had not the great first offsite. People were burnt out. People's attention was really fried. And we realized we had to change the question. What is the limit of people's attention? So we shaved 2 hours off, put a client interview in, and then had people self-organize a game of Pictionary, because the point in part of an offsite is for people to connect. That was a little bit better. But still, people were unsure about why they were there. I thought we'd communicated that. So instead, we changed the question again, and I want to talk about launch system design for a moment. It's a term coined by Christina Harbridge of Allegory. Essentially, it's a way of communicating about an event so that everybody understands purpose. It starts with why. How did that work? Much more engagement, much more well understood purpose. And in fact, we got a chance to try some new things. We decided that we'd turn our conversation about annual goals and annual results into a game show. And we're going to do some other things like a variety show. It's not quite declared center yet, but we're zeroing in on some new practices. Now, in fact, by going through Move to the Edge, we learned a lot, including that offsites might be the wrong word because it's so embedded in the experience of being physically together. But some of the insights we do have can be applied to weekly all-hands meeting, quarterly stakeholders meeting, or any given meeting. And that makes it incredibly valuable. So, I've shown you a framework, move to edge, declare at center. It's a framework, not a formula. You can navigate through uncertainty even if you don't have a playbook. These are practices, and as practices go, they can start slow, but then getting better, get easier, and then become part of your culture. And that's important because solving complex problems is as much as a mindset as it is a set of practices. Now, as Evergreen companies, we're on the edge of what it means to create a company. What does stakeholder value mean? What does people first mean? And these gatherings enable us to get together and discuss that because each of us holds a piece of the puzzle, but when we connect, we're able to solve the whole thing. And while we do that, we have to remember, there's no way through unless you get through the goo. Thanks very much.